With the recent conflict, we are seeing a war of restrictions on airlines. Neither the Russians can fly over Europe or North America, nor can Europeans and North Americans fly over Russia. What laws regulate this? More importantly, what are the consequences for non-compliant airlines? During the last few weeks, we've experienced things that we never thought could even be possible today. I'm discussing not only the dire humanitarian crisis, but also the aeronautical perspective, which is this channel's usual focus. We've witnessed dogfights reminiscent of World War II and significant restrictions on the aviation industry, among other developments. For many years, there has been a calm situation among the world powers, and this has led us to normalize certain things. Like, for example, flying over territories that aren't your own country, or even flying over territories of countries that aren't considered allies. In February 2020, I traveled to Japan with a friend, and the airplane screen displayed the route the plane was taking. We crossed Europe and Russia, but never considered everything behind the scenes that makes these flights possible. Because without prior notice, a plane can't just take off and fly over another country. Basically, so you get the idea, a Spanish plane can't just take off and enter French airspace, just like that. So the reality is that there are hundreds of daily flights that leave Spain and pass through France. What's the process to do this legally? To really understand this, we have to go way back in time, to the beginnings of aviation. In the year 1909, the French pilot Louis Blasius crossed the English Channel by air for the first time in history. However, no legal action such as a passport check was taken to verify that flight. As it was a historic milestone, they didn't deem it necessary. But in 1910, the Paris Conference took place, where several states came together to lay some groundwork for air laws. Since aviation kept progressing, and what started as a historic milestone now seemed possible for several airplanes, it was concluded that the airspace above a territory belongs to that territory. It was only a verbal agreement that was never signed. The signing was postponed for a few months and never actually happened. Why did World War I break out? The tensions between countries made it impossible to meet again to sign it. As mentioned before, during these years, the progress made in aeronautics was immense. And that's why, in 1919, after World War I ended, at the Paris Convention of 1919, all the countries that were involved in the First World War, they saw it as practically mandatory to reach a consensus on developing more aeronautical laws, since commercial aviation was knocking at the door. This is where the following was finally signed. Each country has sovereignty over the airspace above its territories and waters, meaning it can decide which aircraft can enter and which cannot. And in addition, aircraft were required to register under a state, and the aircraft would be given a sort of nationality of the state where it was registered. However, when it comes to laws, it's not that simple. For instance, maritime boundaries are quite well established. A country's territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles from its coastline, treated as part of its territory. From there, the country can control entry as if it were its own territory up to 200 nautical miles from the 12-mile mark. This is what is known as the exclusive economic zone, which gives the country the right to exploit the resources that are within it. These borders defined for the sea do not apply to airspace, as outer space belongs to no one. Satellites in orbit pass over many countries without requiring explanation from those who launched them. However, it's not legal to do that while flying, so where is the border between air and space? This long-standing debate remains unresolved. As discussed in another video on the channel, this is a general overview. Space is typically defined as starting from the Kármán line, around 100 km altitude. But it was set there, just as it could have been set at 120 kilometers. So is it possible that this could change in the future? And with that change, what is considered airspace would also change, although the problem comes with the upper limit with space. But as for the border limit, a country's airspace is considered to be what is within its borders, including the 12 nautical miles of territorial sea. With that, everything is clear. The next time the topic of aeronautical law was seriously discussed was in 1944. At the Chicago Convention, the holy grail for aeronautics, which laid the foundations that are still in effect today. In reality, each country has sovereignty over its airspace and can draft laws more or less as it wishes. In the Chicago Convention, countries are explicitly asked to draft their aeronautical laws based on guidelines common to everyone in the Chicago Convention. And that's why, in reality, all countries have very similar aeronautical laws. They are all based on the Chicago Convention, which is why I call it the Holy Grail. Several topics discussed at the Chicago Convention are worth highlighting. For instance, commercial aircraft must never be shot down under any circumstances. It was also stated that an unscheduled flight cannot fly over another territory. Or, for example, that the authorities of a country have the right to inspect an aircraft as soon as it lands in their own territory. Obviously, there are many more things like this, but today they seem normal to us, but at that time they weren't. In addition, what are known as the freedoms of the air were created, a series of rights that countries grant to airlines from other countries. They are summarized in 9, and to illustrate this, let's draw 3 countries, and the aircraft we're going to use as a reference is registered in this country. First freedom, the right for an aircraft to fly over a country without landing. Second freedom, the right for an aircraft to refuel or undergo maintenance, but without exchanging goods or passengers and then continue on its route. Third freedom, the right for an aircraft to land as its final destination in another country that is not its country of origin. Fourth freedom, the right for an aircraft to take off from a country that is not its own to return to its own country. Fifth freedom, the right to stop in another country. And now, yes, to exchange passengers or cargo and then continue traveling to another country. Sixth freedom, the right for an aircraft to fly from one country to its home country, exchange passengers or cargo, and continue to a third country. Seventh freedom, the right for an aircraft to fly between 2 countries that are not its country of origin. For example, a British Airways aircraft operating between France and Spain. Eighth freedom, the right for an aircraft to leave its country of registration, make a stop in another country, and then continue within that same country. This drawing may seem confusing, but imagine it represents a very large country, like the United States. This would be, for example, like if a British Airways plane that stops over in Boston could then continue on to San Diego, for example. The last one is the right for an aircraft to fly domestically in a country different from where it's registered. For instance, an Air France flight from Madrid to Barcelona. These freedoms encompass all the possibilities. Countries began permitting flights through agreements with foreign airlines, allowing them to operate specific routes. But of course, this was an impressive amount of work because all the routes operated by all the airlines had to study which freedoms they needed. For example, in the longest flight ever operated in history, as we mentioned a few months ago, a plane from Qantas, an Australian airline, departing from London, flew over the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, until it began to fly over Australia. Therefore, it would have had to request permission from all those countries to fly over them, as well as request permission from the United Kingdom to take off from there. But of course, if one of these countries didn't give permission, the route would have to be reorganized, and they would have to go around that country, spending more money on fuel and flight time. If the country not allowing flyover is Belarus, it's not an issue since it's relatively small and can be circumvented. But what happens if the one who doesn't let you is Russia? All the routes from Europe to Asia go through Russia. Literally, those routes couldn't be carried out. For this reason, Russia often threatens Europe, usually by saying it will close its airspace to Western countries, because they know it would be very damaging. Yes, I recorded that part a couple of weeks ago. The European Union and North America have banned Russian aircraft from flying over their territory, and Russia has responded in kind. This is actually very helpful for understanding what we're discussing in this video, but it's really bad for everything else. Over the past 30 years, allied countries have made agreements to avoid requesting permission for each flight. The first instance of this took place in 1992 between the United States and the Netherlands. Over the following years, the United States signed these agreements with other European countries. Until in 2007, a treaty was signed that united the United States and all of Europe. Almost all flights can operate between any destinations without requiring permission from countries. That means, for example, a flight from New York to Rome shouldn't have to ask for permission either from Italy to land or from the countries it will fly over. As you know, until just a few weeks ago, air routes were operating completely normally. Aviation was still recovering from the pandemic, but there were virtually no geopolitical restrictions. However, due to events in Ukraine, it was decided to take extremely severe retaliatory measures against the airlines. On February 24th, the United Kingdom banned Russian airlines or those linked to Russia from flying over or operating in its airspace. Russia responded similarly, and in the following days, many countries followed suit in this order. After the United Kingdom, the following countries joined: Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Poland, Estonia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, Germany, Italy, Iceland, Austria, Netherlands, Malta, Denmark, Canada, Luxembourg, Croatia, Albania, France, Cyprus, Hungary, Ireland, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Slovakia, Switzerland, North Macedonia, Bermuda, Montenegro, and the United States of America, Russia. Of course, it responded to all of them in the same way. This was the case until March 3rd, 2022. This has led to some very shocking things being seen, such as on February 26, 2022, after the closure of Russian airspace to German airlines. Some flights were caught in the middle of their journey and had to turn back. That was the case for this Deutsche Lufthansa 718 from Lufthansa departing from Munich and heading to Seoul, South Korea. The flight was supposed to last about 9 hours, but that day they learned about the restrictions halfway through the flight and had to turn back. The passengers spent about 7 hours on the plane only to end up at the same departure airport. On February 25th of this year, the British Airways 142 flight from London to New Delhi also suffered the consequences of the restrictions as well. Its original route before all the conflict was this one. Later, with the impossibility of flying over Russia, the route had to be modified. To this, completely avoiding Russian airspace and of course also Ukrainian airspace. And for those of you wondering, this strange curve here, I suppose it's to avoid flying over Afghanistan. Something similar happened with Aeroflot Flight Aeroflot 2091 from Belgrade to Moscow. Normally, the planned route was this one, but with the start of the first bans by Poland, they had to switch to this route. On February 26th, the average flight time increased from about 3 hours to 5. But the next day, with restrictions from other European countries, access from the north became impossible. The sole remaining option required 6 hours of travel. The following day, February 27th, the route was cancelled. It's also fascinating how Kaliningrad communicates with the rest of Russia. This territory belongs to Russia, however, all neighboring countries are prohibiting Russian flights over their airspace. What they do to communicate then is go at least 12 nautical miles off the coast through the Baltic Sea until they reach St. Petersburg. Since, as we mentioned before, the sovereignty of an airspace is limited to 12 miles from the coast, so there's no issue with the plane flying through that corridor. The problem with all these restrictions will be when the armed conflict ends. All the air freedoms that have been taken away in this war of air restrictions will take a long time to come back. And that's a big problem both for the airlines and for the citizens. This is where the video's question arises. What are the consequences if a commercial plane fails to follow the restrictions? As I mentioned, the Chicago Convention explicitly prohibits the shooting down of commercial passenger aircraft. So is it very difficult for a passenger plane to get shot down? Although probably all countries would say that if an aircraft flies over their territory without permission, they would shoot it down. I don't think it's that easy to shoot down a commercial aircraft, honestly, but it's also true that it's important to consider how tense the situation is right now. The truth is, it's very tense. And probably, if an aircraft were to fly over the territory now without permission, there would be a pretty big problem. In the next video, we'll discuss the downing of commercial aircraft, as Russia, the United States, and other countries have done it. We'll see it in the next video. We'll also examine other historical instances where aeronautical law principles were utterly disregarded. Thanks for watching. Please like and share if you enjoyed the video to support me. Remember, you can contact me directly on my social media. I'll see you next time. One more thing before I go. For those seeking a channel like mine, check out Ingeniería Real, created by the founder of Real Engineering. With over 3 million followers, he is now publishing his Spanish videos on this new channel. It was one of the most inspiring channels for my current work. If you like engineering, you'll love the content.